Hello, my sober lovelies. Before we dive in, I'm really excited to announce my group coaching program for women is live, and you can join now. So excited for this because let's be real here. Quitting drinking isn't just about saying no to the glass of wine or booze. It's about what comes after. All the fear, the boredom, the late night anxiety, and the stories you've been telling yourself for years. And that's where my Rewired Sober group coaching program for women comes in. It's only $247. I'm being totally transparent on the price. It's for 3 months, and you'll learn how to shift your mindset, build habits that actually stick, and question the core beliefs that have been keeping you stuck, and find healthier ways to deal with that loneliness and that now what feeling. The best part is you don't have to do it alone. We'll have live group coaching sessions weekly, and there'll be a bunch of women walking through it with you. It's not another cookie cutter sobriety program for mommy vloggers. It's neuroscience meets real life, and it's designed for women to help you not just stay sober, but actually feel good living sober. You can join anytime, and I'd love to see you on the inside. So start today, get instant access. The link's in the show notes. Welcome to Rewired Sober, the podcast where we unpack what it really takes to rewire your brain after alcohol. Hi, I'm your host, Kate Vitella, a registered nurse, board certified in mental health and addiction, sober since 2018, and a coach who blends neuroscience, lived experience, and real talk to help women break the shame spiral and rebuild their thinking with tools like journaling, humor, and honest conversation. This isn't surface level sobriety. This is where the healing gets deep, grounded, and unapologetically honest. So let's get into it. Welcome back to Rewired Sober. And this one is going to be a solo episode. I'd like to talk about the science of storytelling in sobriety. So before I completely dive in, I want to share one of my favorite quotes. And I think I probably say this on several of the podcasts that I've guested on, as well as my own. And that is that stories go where science can't. And this line comes from the book Burnout by Emily and Amelia Nagoski, where they explain how storytelling reaches into the emotional and the embodied parts of our experience in ways that data and logic can't always touch. I read this book during a time when I was working as a director of nursing for a psychiatric facility. It's kind of a big job. I was on call 24/7. It was just high pressure, and I was in early sobriety, so maybe 2-3 years in, maybe more than that, but around that time. And I was really trying to prove my worth, and I took some time out, and I went out to the beach, and I read this book, and I think I read it cover to cover during that week off, and I just absolutely loved it, and I've listened to the audiobook since. But that line from the book, I think I've repeated several times because stories do go where science can't. And the miracle that is AA, that was created in its first inception, is that Dr. Bob and Bill Wilson, they seem to understand this deeply, the power of storytelling in a safe place. Before like brain scans or trauma theory or household concepts, they sort of instinctively built a model around shared experience, vulnerability, and connection. And it really worked. Because when people hear, like, me too, so have I, yes, same, they begin to believe in a new possibility for themselves. And that's the beauty of what they discovered in AA, right? That was the magic right there, is the healing power of shared experiences. And so I think it's important to point that out. In one of my previous episodes, I mentioned something about AA reciting folklore, and I sort of regret saying that because it diminishes the true magic of what AA is, and that was, in its first inception, was storytelling and being honest with another individual. So what I meant was this: it's full of powerful stories, but AA is often built on unquestioned truisms that aren't really explained very well. And it sort of lacks a framework for why it works. Doesn't cite any science, or for me personally, it didn't really help connect the dots between like healing and the nervous system. I was curious about these things as a nurse, my personal identity or neuroplasticity. But I do believe AA and how it was created and sitting around telling stories, that was a miracle. Um, and that's what I believe people still need today to not just blindly follow or repeat any slogans or what any coach tells you, but to understand what's going on in your healing process. That's how you reclaim a sense of personal agency. So, really, I mean, the shortcoming of that group was sticking to 1930s literature in AA, but that's okay because it still helped a lot of people. So I don't want you to think that I'm bashing it in any way. I regret saying that it was folklore. It just doesn't always explain why it helps. But I do believe people deserve to understand why what they're doing is working. And like I said, not just blindly follow slogans. And so I wanted to talk about why we sit around and tell stories, why we share in meetings, and scientifically what's going on there so that it gives you more of a sense of agency in your own recovery and maybe encourages you to open up in a support group or with a coach or a mentor, sponsor, whatever is working for you at the time. So, for me personally, someone who has worked for the last, 7 years in patient psych, I'm trained to listen to stories without flinching. I've sat with people in their darkest, rawest, most chaotic moments on the clock as a nurse. And I've learned something essential, which is that we're all just humans doing the best we can to cope. And life gets messy. And honestly, it's expected, at least for me anyway. People are going to develop coping mechanisms for a reason, whether it's alcohol, perfectionism, gambling, people pleasing, food. Those tools were strategies for survival for people at some point. So I really try to be understanding of that. And that perspective is what keeps me grounded and compassionate when I'm coaching. I'm not here to judge your story. I'm here to help you understand it. And if I'm being real, there's a moment when someone shares like the wildest, unfiltered part of their story. And instead of pulling away, something in me just leans in. You know, One of my first AA meetings, a woman told a story about getting a DUI and the child drop off in the morning for school. And really, all she had drank to get intoxicated was mouthwash. And, whereas some people would be surprised by that, I found myself just nodding and saying, yep, like a quiet sigh. And that's because, personally over time, I've learned to lean in to what is radical empathy. And like I said, I have a little bit more of a trained nervous system that no longer flinches. Um, but it's not just because I'm a nurse. I've seen this same capacity in so many recovery spaces, from church basements to Zoom rooms. There's something about being in a room full of people telling the truth that rewires how we listen. So we start learning to not react, to not flinch, to not pile on more shame. It's like emotional literacy by immersion. If you sit in enough circles, you start to understand that when someone's sharing something hard, your job is not to gasp or flinch, and your job is not also to fix it. It's to witness it, because that's the sacred part. That's the healing. And I remember when I first read Laura McCowan's We Are the Luckiest, there was this recognition in me when she said, "We are all magnificent monsters, that we are capable of the light and the dark." And I know this today deep in my bones. And that is part of why I can hold space for people without flinching, and why I love people not in spite of their mess, but because of it. Because that's part of what makes this work sacred. I mean, sometimes I still have like flashes, like full body hits of really awful, like chaotic, shame filled things I did in active addiction. I've been sober over 7 years at this point, and I have flashes of these things I swore I would never tell a soul. And when those flashes come, I think of that quote, we are all magnificent monsters. We're all capable of these things, and I'm not disqualified by my darkness. I'm qualified by the fact that I've lived through it, and so have you, and come out on the other side with more empathy and not less. Because of their lived experiences of addiction, healing, motherhood, trauma, what have you, redemption, stories, they reach people in a way that data never can. And here's the kicker. Storytelling doesn't just inspire us emotionally, it literally opens the brain. So, research in social neuroscience and narrative psychology shows that stories activate areas of the brain responsible for empathy and emotional regulation and even decision making. So, social neuroscience specifically looks at how our brains are wired to connect and how social interactions shape the structure and the function of our brain over time. When we hear someone share something vulnerably in a meeting, in a podcast, on a one-on-one conversation, our mirror neurons fire. We emotionally stimulate the speaker's experience. So it's sort of allowing us to feel it with them. And that's not just like emotional bonding, that's how our neurobiology works. So, in a 12-step meeting or a group recovery circle, this is why storytelling is so powerful. When someone shares their experience, their strength and hope, it creates a sort of neurological bridge that allows the listener to imagine new possibilities for themselves, right? You're kind of putting yourself in that person's shoes. The process overall reduces shame, it increases the empathy, and it literally opens new neural pathways in the listener's brain. And especially for women, I feel like storytelling is legacy. It's bonding. It's how we transmit emotional wisdom, and we pass down survival strategies, and we normalize the messy middle. I mean, and also women love to talk, right? When we hear like, me too, same, I did that as well, or someone comes back with a funny story of what they did, we're not just validated, we're actually neurologically primed to shift our own story. So this capacity stems from like our brain's evolutionary wiring, if you will. From early human history, our survival depended on learning through shared experience. Storytelling, it activated neural pathways for memory and empathy and behavioral change, making it easier to adopt new strategies without direct exposure to danger. So, neuroplasticity isn't only about like repetition, it's also about novelty and a topic I want to bring into this relational safety. So, and storytelling sort of delivers both of those at the same time. It's a new perspective, right? It's novelty, it's shared in a supportive, attuned environment and creates relational safety. We feel safe around those we're sharing with. And it creates like this perfect storm for brain change. So our brains are wired not to just survive, but to adapt. And hearing someone else's narrative, it really helps us like envision our own possibilities. And this is how change happens, not just in theory, but in real neural architecture. Um, so, narrative psychology is like the study of how we make sense of our lives through the stories we tell. And I've looked into researchers like Dan McAdams, and he talks about like our personal identity is largely shaped by the narrative we construct about ourselves, right? We commonly will throw around the phrase like, "What story are you telling yourself about that?" Brene Brown is really famous for, increasing that dialogue of, the story I'm telling myself is, not increasing, encouraging. Brene Brown's really good at putting it into words, and when she talks about, arguments with her husband, she will say, "The story I'm telling myself is." And that's a good way of, it's like how our identity is shaped by the stories we tell ourselves about a situation. It's the narrative we've constructed about ourselves. But here's the thing, that story isn't fixed, it evolves. So the story you're telling yourself about yourself can evolve. And the act of retelling the story, especially in a supportive space, it helps us shift from this narrative of like, I'm broken to I'm a survivor, or even like, I'm growing. I mean, if you've ever been a person who's told your personal story in recovery circles and you've done it several times, you're actually sort of shifting that narrative in your own brain to being more of the hero of the story. I mean, I personally love to tell my story, to get on podcasts, because every time I'm able to not spin it, but to see another area where I actually overcame, to be a little bit proud of myself in certain areas. And I actually have developed a little bit of compassion for myself over time of telling that story and listening to myself say it out loud. It's kind of reconfigured how things have happened in my mind. And the interesting part is sometimes when I tell my personal story, is I'll leave out certain parts of it depending on what audience I'm around. And their reaction also mirrors back to me, you know, different things that kind of activate different neural pathways, and I form different stories and narratives. And I sort of walk away with a different experience every time. Little gems I pick up, or, someone else points out to me. It's really fascinating how this works. So storytelling in recovery is like a massive part of it, because addiction is often it's accompanied by like a distorted inner narrative, right? We know that the story we're telling ourselves is filled with shame and blame and self erasure. And when we tell the truth, when we say it out loud in a meeting, on a podcast, on a blog, or, for me, even when I tell the truth in coaching sessions, we reclaim our authorship. We interrupt that default mode, and that default mode network that keeps recycling the old shame instead of creating like a coherent redemptive arc. It's not just therapeutic, it's actually transformational. And here's another fascinating thing. When we hear other people's stories, especially from someone we admire, we often feel like a deep compassion for them, right? I've listened to Laura McCowan tell her story several times. She's someone I admire as a writer. And even when that person that you're listening to, even when they've done things that are like messy and painful or morally complicated, I should say, um, even when we listen to them tell those types of stories, we still become more compassionate for them. And that's not accidental. So, neuroscience actually shows that hearing emotionally charged stories, even when people cry, even when they tell you the gory details, it activates your brain's empathy circuits. and the parts that are involved in understanding others' feelings and emotions. That grows you as a human, that changes you. And when we engage with someone else's story, remember I said our mirror neurons, they light up. And try to say that a few times fast. Mirror neurons. But these neurons light up and we begin to sort of emotionally simulate their experience. I'm sure you've felt this when you're listening to someone else's story. Emotionally, you kind of simulate what they're going through and it creates a bond. And this is why I could read Laura McCowan's book and feel like we were friends, right? In my head, we were friends, even though she described like doing things that on paper, they looked pretty chaotic and messy. And she did some things as a mom, she's not proud of. I'd never felt judgment for her. I loved her even more for her honesty. And that story, it gave me compassion for her. So I'm kind of trying to explain like the science of this because it's a really fascinating thing. And here's the plot twist. It also made me a little softer with myself. Hearing other people's stories, developing compassion for them, I softened toward myself a little. It's always been harder to forgive my own worst moments than someone else's. But when I saw how much grace I could extend to another woman in recovery, it cracked the door open. That if I could love her through her darkness, if I could love her through her shameful, humiliating moments, then maybe I wasn't so unlovable after all. And that's the quiet, powerful work of storytelling. It doesn't just change how we see others, it gently rewires how we see ourselves. There are recent studies in neuroaesthetics. It's the neuroscience of how art impacts the brain. It shows that, like, emotionally resonant stories activate the same reward pathways as music and visual art. These emotionally resonant stories, they engage what we call the default mode network. I know I'm throwing a lot of science at you here. The DMN, it's that system involved in self-reflection and identity formation and imagining the future. I'm not telling you all this to sound smart. I'm telling you this because that DMN area center, it's it's often an overactive place for people struggling with addiction. And why is this? Because if you take nothing more from this podcast, addiction thrives in isolation. It's rumination, it's disconnection. And that DMN, that is part of the brain that's the most active when we're not engaged with the outside world. It's where the brain goes when it's sort of off task, when it's left alone with your looping thoughts, unprocessed shame, distorted self perception. Those are things that often fuel addiction. Tommy Rosen, he always says, don't go to that bad neighborhood in your mind alone and stay there, right? Don't stay disconnected. Because over time, these sort of repetitive narratives, they can solidify into our default identity. Like, I've gone too far. I don't deserve to be forgiven. Um, I'm the problem, or I'll never change. I'll never get sober. Right? I mean, I certainly have thought that for sure. Like, I'm broken and it's too late for me. Um, so as Tommy Rosen says, we don't want to go to the bad neighborhood in our mind alone and stay there because listening and buying into these repetitive narratives, they can really solidify that into our identity, what we believe to be true about ourselves. You know, that DMN network is the part of the brain that replays those old stories. So we have to interrupt those loops with new stories, with healing stories. So we're not just having a feel-good moment. We're literally updating the mental script that our brain uses to define who we are. And that's why storytelling and sobriety isn't fluff. It's actually neuroscience in action. And again, I have to point out that in the 1930s, that Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob, figured this part out and said, let's sit in circle and talk about our stuff and be honest. I mean, that was a brilliant breakthrough because that was the first time anybody ever did that. So I have to give kudos to AA for that part. You know, when we hear powerful stories, we don't just absorb the facts. We actually feel them. And that's why certain moments stay with us. They become part of how we see ourselves. Our brains internalize this emotional resonance of that story, and when we kind of weave it in to the fabric of our own self-narrative. And it's not like a metaphorical thing, it's neurological. Again, a story, when a story triggers like an emotional shift, it can activate the same area of the brain responsible for our autobiographical memory, our regular memory. Meaning basically, though, what we hear, it can become part of our personal identity structure. So if you hear a story about someone who's finding hope in recovery, who thought all was lost or had tried multiple times to get sober and they finally did it, um, they finally set a boundary and they finally took their power back. You hear those stories, your brain says, that could be me. And this is imagined identification, but it's powerful because it helps the brain rehearse a new possibility for action, a new possibility for emotions, for your self-concept. So over time, these vicarious experiences, living vicariously through someone else's story, it creates a mental blueprint so you can change. And that's essentially the science behind why one story told at the right time, it can change everything. I've said one insight can shift everything for you. Reading one book, listening to one podcast, it really can change because it completely can change the blueprint for how you think. And this matters big time in sobriety. I mean, you've heard many of us talk about picking up a book or listening to a podcast or listening to someone speak, and at that moment, things shifted for them. Because when we feel stuck and isolated or ashamed, stories remind us we're not alone. I still to this day think about listening to Laura McCowan's book, We Are the Luckiest, on a long drive home from a party. And I just needed to hear her voice telling her story. I think I was 3 years sober. I, I was in a good space, but I just needed to feel less alone at that moment. I mean, I really encourage audiobooks for this reason, just simply to hear someone's voice. And that healing is possible for them, but it's also possible for you. And it becomes sort of inevitable when we stay connected to groups, when we stay where the stories are told in those safe places. Storytelling, it also plays a bit of a unique role for females. We we all know this as females. We love to go to the bathroom together. We love to bond. We love to tell stories. It's been called emotional inheritance for women because we've passed down stories for generations of our own strength and survival and grief. But it's more than just a woman thing for us woman folk, as they would say in AA. Like in modern recovery spaces, we see this sitting in a circle at a retreat. Um, Even a bit of social media can help provide this. When one woman speaks her truth on a reel and it's honest and authentic, she sort of unconsciously gives other women permission to do the same thing. That shared vulnerability, not as a weakness, it can literally help us heal each other. And that's part of the reason why I ask every guest on this podcast to tell their story, at least a part of it. I never intended for this podcast to be people's recovery stories. There are 8 million sober podcasts out there like that. But of course, everyone that I bring on has a story, and it's important to understand a bit of their backstory because I always hope that someone listening will resonate and some of these emotional and cognitive changes will take place. Um, so that is why I sort of wanted to explain this because as we're moving into, categorically this being about rewiring and sobriety, there'll still be stories. There'll still be people coming on where we're just laughing and talking about how they recovered and what their life looks like now and the mindset shifts that they went through. Plus, it's fun. I mean, how much do you want to hear me talk about neuroscience, for God's sake? I mean, you got to be bored of me already. So that's why I try not to do so many solo episodes. To me, this stuff is really fascinating. And for some reason, for me, if I understand how and why it's working in my brain, it sticks more. So I hope that this was somewhat helpful. And I sort of want to end this piece out by saying, um, these are the only spaces I ever want to inhabit. Again, are these sober, truth-telling spaces. You know, as that saying goes, the houses where the truth is told, where it's safe to be myself. And there's something I've noticed after years in these recovery spaces, where people are telling stories. They are some of the most badass, emotionally intelligent humans I've ever met. Not because they're perfect, but because they've learned how to stay in the room. They've sat in the rooms with strangers crying, with people telling horrific stories, and they've resisted the urge to fix or judge or run away. They've learned how to hold space because they understand what it's like to need that space held for them. So I find myself gravitating to recovery spaces for this reason. So many people in these spaces have also unlearned that performative aspect of adulting and humaning. They've unlearned performance overall and to walk in with that polished mask. I mean, almost to a default. I remember one of my friends early in AA trying to date and telling me that he was just brutally honest with everybody on their first date, dumping his entire story, because we've sort of at that point taken the mask off and we've committed to self-honesty and to honesty to others. And so, we can almost be honest to a default. And people in recovery have, survived rock bottom. And they still show up to hold someone else's hand, to hold that space. And that kind of capacity, it just doesn't come from a textbook. You can't learn that way. It has to come from having your own heart broken and letting it stay open long enough to heal and to help others heal it. And that's what makes it so extraordinary. So going forward, I want to have you keep this in mind to stay engaged with other people's stories. Keep reading books and listening to podcasts, listening to speakers, even watching a few reels on social media if you find yourself in a place where it gets lonely. Because this is how we survive. A big reason I started this podcast is because podcasts literally saved my ass in early sobriety. Having a podcast in my ear all the time, stories and advice and laughter and tips and putting myself in other people's shoes. So many times I'd be on long walks, imagining myself in other people's stories. And that was transformative. So I hope this storytelling tutorial was a helpful tip for you. And moving on, we're going to crack open a bit more neuroscience, but we're also going to just keep it human and keep it real. So thanks for hanging out with me. Thanks for tuning in to Rewired Sober. You can find me on my Instagram at Rewired Sober, where there are links to catch up with me and all the things I'm working on in my coaching business, or the link tree to my business directly will be in the show notes. I so appreciate you joining me on this journey, and I welcome any feedback or any topics you want to hear about, things that you're struggling with or interested in. I love you all so very much, and I'm just so enjoying doing this with you.